Now back to the video. So here's a quick recap of where we got to in part 1 of the build, focusing on the body and the wheels. If you had missed that, I'll leave a link in the description for that video. For part 2 of the build, we'll be focusing on the chassis, the cockpit and the final assembly. So as usual, we start by taking the parts off the sprues. Once we've got all the parts we need, we'll need to clean up all the excess plastic, as well as smooth out some of the surfaces. We'll be using TAMIYA's sanding sponge, the 600 grit. As I mentioned in part 1 of the build, the plastic is harder than your conventional TAMIYA kits, so just be careful when you do clean up the edges with a hobby knife, not to cut into the plastic. Unfortunately, it did happen to me when I wasn't concentrating. So now we've given all the parts a bit of a clean, just with some lukewarm water and some soap. And then we'll assemble some of the parts ready for paint. For this I just used TAMIYA's extra thin cement. Right, now we're finally ready for primer. I covered the parts with TAMIYA's primer, the white fine surface primer. Because I'm using the spray can, I just had to be careful not to lay it on too thick. Then after about an hour or so, I started painting the cockpit and the chassis. I was using TAMIYA's XF1 flat black for this. I wasn't too concerned on the paint coverage for underneath the cockpit, just because it was going to be covered up as soon as it gets mounted on the chassis. Once the paint had dried, I covered the flat black with a flat clear, just to protect the paint. Now that the big parts are ready, I've started to paint all the smaller items, like the brake discs, the brake calipers, the gearbox, and the radiators. Once the airbrushing was done, there were some touch-ups that needed to be made with the brush. Then we also had to add the decals to the radiators. For applying the decals, I used Microscale's Microsol and Microset. I'll leave a link in the description below. Now that we've got all the parts ready, we can start the chassis assembly process. Once we started with the assembly process, didn't really have any fitment issues. The instructions were quite straightforward and clear, and the parts just fell into place. As I'd mentioned in part 1, I was quite disappointed that that this model came without an engine. You could just see this big hole in the back of the chassis. So once we finished installing the gearbox and the radiators, we started working on the suspension, and then the rear axle, and then ultimately the rear brakes. Then once we finished in the rear of the car, we moved on to the cockpit, where it was only the race seat and the gear shift that we had to install. The rest of the cockpit, like the dash and the steering wheel, is actually connected to the center cowl, which forms part of the body. Similar to the rear, the front is quite straightforward. There's no suspension or anything, so we just installed the steering knuckle, the rack and pinion, and the brakes for now, and that was it. Finish off the chassis assembly, I just added some panel liner to the radiators, and we were ready to move on. Now we're moving on to the final assembly on this build. The final assembly can be described as 4 main steps. So the first step is to attach the center cowl to the chassis. Overall, it's actually a very snug and tight fit. You only need to use a little glue on the side to attach the panels to the chassis itself. But overall, I was surprised it was such a good fit. The next up, we had to install the exhaust pipes. For aesthetics, they added the exhaust pipes to the turbochargers, which then connected to the radiators as well. I imagine this is built up a lot more, obviously, when you've got the full detailed set with the engine as well. But this would do for now, as the rear cowl is going to be connected or glued in place anyway, so we won't be able to see any of this. The front cowl, it required a bit of jiggery pokery and wiggling about, but eventually it got into place and it was a perfect fit. Once the front cowl was installed, there was only a few steps left. Next up, we connected the wheels. With a little back and forth, they went in absolutely fine. Then after the wheels were installed, there was only really the rear wing and rear cowl left. So we started by installing the rear wing onto the rear cowl. And then wiggle into place the rear cowl to join the center cowl. This was quite straightforward. The rear cowl wasn't perfectly in place, but I wasn't too concerned about that because ultimately I would have had to glue down the rear wing onto the bracketry that was coming out of the gearbox. Then I just had the side view mirror and the antennas, and I called it good. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and subscribe, it's free. And I'll see you in the next one. Keep modeling.